Good evening, friends. This is the third video of the summary of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Here we start where Mr. Darcy visits his estate unexpectedly and he sees Elizabeth is also there, and he is very happy to see Elizabeth. Elizabeth visits the estate knowing that Darcy is not in the estate, but seeing him she is also very happy unexpectedly. Now Darcy invites Elizabeth and gardeners, the gardener couples, Mr. Colin, and to meet his sister Georgina. She is a little sister and she very much likes Elizabeth upon meeting Elizabeth. Now Elizabeth is surprised and delighted by the treatment that she is given by Darcy. She then receives a news when they are there enjoying their stay. She suddenly receives a news that her younger sister Lydia has run off with Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham is the same man who tries to spread false words about Mr. Darcy, and this causes Elizabeth in disliking Darcy earlier. Now this man runs away with Lydia. Elizabeth tells this news to Mr. Darcy and she decides to leave the estate and go and never to see again Mr. Darcy, since this elopement of Lydia and Wickham has ruined the family's good name. Now, after she goes away, Mr. Darcy tries to settle this marriage and tries to, in some respect, in some aspect, try to give the good name of the family back to the Bennets. Now Wickham agrees to marry Lydia, surprisingly, after the elopement, which Mr. Darcy has found out. Now this marriage somehow restores the decency of the family. Now Lydia visits the family after the marriage with Wickham, and she tells Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy has settled their marriage and Wickham has agreed to marry Lydia only after Mr. Darcy saying that he will waive all the debts that Mr. Darcy owns to Wickham. Now, though Mr. Darcy had sworn her to secrecy, that is, Mr. Darcy had told her not to tell this to anyone. Now, Mrs. Gardiner also feels obliged to inform the Elizabeth that he secured the match at great expense and trouble to himself. She hints that he may have another motive. That motive may be Elizabeth. Now, Mr. Gardiner also hints that Darcy may be in love with Elizabeth, and Darcy is doing all this owning to the love that he has for Elizabeth. Mr. Bingley, the friend of Darcy, and Darcy return to the Netherfield, the neighborhood of the Bennet family. Now Bingley proposes to Jane. After Mr. Darcy explains him the situation that Jane was also in love with Mr. Bingley. Now Jane accepts this proposal very happily. Lady Catherine, having heard the rumours that Elizabeth is loving Mr. Darcy, visits Elizabeth and demands that she promises never to accept Mr. Darcy's proposal. Elizabeth has also by this time being attracted towards Darcy, and she refuses the lady outrageously. Now this makes the Lady Catherine furious, since she is a very renowned lady and no one has ever refused her anything because of her high position and status. Now Darcy is disheartened by his aunt's behavior. Now Elizabeth has difficulty in convincing her father that she is marrying for love, not for position and wealth. But Mr. Bennet is finally convinced that Elizabeth and the Darcy are in love with each other. Mrs. Bennet is exceedingly happy that she has a match like Mr. Darcy, and she quickly changes her opinion about Mr. Darcy. The novel then concludes with an overview of the marriage of three daughters, and the marriage of the two daughters being for love and not for money, and the great satisfaction of both the parents that their three daughters are happily settled, and most of the happiness is for Elizabeth marrying Darcy. So friends, this was the story of Pride and Prejudice. I will be also uploading the notes, so if anyone is not following the videos can also follow the notes also. Thank you.